Alright, so welcome to our second lecture for our EDU Onyx course on socket programming in C. And today we're going to be talking about the HTTP protocol and how we can implement that on top of the socket protocols that we looked at in the last lesson, TCP. So for a quick review, like we talked about last time, sockets are the basic building blocks of network communication. They're how we connect to things on the internet, and more basically, though, how we make connections between any software. So if we want to request a website, get information from a particular web server, at the most basic level, we can use sockets. And most of the information on the internet, the information that we can access using the HTTP protocol, which we're going to be looking at implementing in today's lesson. So HTTP is built on top of the existing TCP protocol, and in our last lesson we looked at creating TCP clients and TCP servers. So these use the lower level protocol, which just basically specifies the connection, and then after that, you can send back and forth any kind of data that you want when you're just implementing the TCP protocol and writing an application that acts as TCP client or TCP server. So for HTTP, we use the TCP protocol, but what changes is the data that we send back and forth. It needs to have a specific format, and it needs to basically the client needs to tell the server what information it's requesting, and then the server sends back that information. So HTTP has this sort of request and response cycle. On the client side, the client sends a request for data, and the server responds with a response that has a particular format, and on the server side, basically the other end of that. So we're going to take a look at implementing both the client and server side of this protocol. So in HTTP, we start with sockets, but on the client side, we write some special data to the server first to ask for a particular resource. So in a lot of cases, we just request a particular file or whatever information it is we want to access. And we send that request to the server. It's the first send command on the client side. And then the server responds back with a particular response, either containing the resource or information as to why that resource could not be returned. After the HTTP server has received the request from the client, it either retrieves the resource and returns it back in what's called the response body, and sends back a status code that lets the client know the resource was retrieved successfully. In this example here, we see the server sends back the status code that's on the first line. 200 is a status code that means everything's okay. And in the response body, we should find whatever we requested. So in a lot of cases, when you visit sites on the web, that's HTML. So that's the data that you get back, and then you can see the HTML rendered in your browser. In a lot of cases, that's what's making the HTTP request. But however you're making the request, the response gets sent back to the client, and then the client does whatever it needs to do to process that data, and then can continue sending further requests to the server. So in order to get a better understanding of how sockets work underneath the HTTP protocol, we're going to start by implementing an HTTP server that we can access from our web browser, and that renders some HTML for us that we'll implement using sockets and C. So let's get started with the server. So like in the previous socket lessons, we're going to need actually most of the same include files. Standard IO. Standard library. We're going to need one additional include, since we're going to want to manipulate the string data that we're working with here in order to build our HTTP response from the server. We're going to include the string header. That's just string.h. And then the usual socket headers, types, socket, and the in.h. And then we can create our main function. So, since most of the response is actually pretty standard in sockets, all we need to do is really just send some data out to any clients that connect. The first thing that we're going to need to do that's going to be different than the socket programs that we've written thus far, including the TCP server, is we're going to need to get the data of the file that we're going to be using as our HTTP response. So we want to render an HTML file, or we want to send an HTML file as part of the HTTP response. So we're going to use the C methods for opening and reading from files in order to do that. So first we're going to need to create a file object to hold the information from our file and read from. So we can create a file pointer to hold the data. And then we'll use the fopen function from the standard library in order to open a index.html file, and then we'll use that to read. So the first parameter to fopen allows us to specify the file that we're going to open. In this case, that'll be our HTML file. And that's what our server is going to serve. It'll be the response body that our browser will get back. And the second parameter is basically an indicator as to how we want to use the file that we're opening. W indicates that we're going to write to the file, and R indicates that we're going to read from the file. And since we want to read, the second parameter will be an R. So, since we have a file object, we need an actual string to store the HTML of the file in it. We'll just call that response data. And we're going to make it big enough so that we can hold a decent bit of information in here. Then all we need to do to read from the file is we can call the fgetS function and read it into this response data string. The first parameter is where we're going to read the data to. The second parameter is how much data to read. We're going to fill up the whole thing. And then the last parameter is the file that we're reading from. So in this case, we just specify the HTML data file object we created with the fopen function. So this is basically all we need to do to open our HTML file and read it into our application. So this is the only part that doesn't really have to deal with the sockets. From here on, we're going to be implementing basically what looked like the TCP server, with a couple of changes that need to be standardized for the HTTP protocol. So first we're going to create that first line of our response. In the slides, we basically said this is the line that has the status code that lets the client or whoever's making a request to the server know what happened when a particular resource was requested. So we'll create a string for that.